Hi, I'm Ryan, and welcome to another episode of Marlborough Minute. Today we have a special guest, Voutas Donegan, author of the powerful book, 3003 Days of Mike and Me. Martha, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Ryan. I'm really happy to be here.
So this book chronicles your relationship with Vietnam veteran Michael Creamer in the years after the war, through his struggles with PTSD to his eventual suicide in 1991. It is a deeply personal story that shines a light on the traumas of war and their lingering impacts. What made you decide to write this book and share your very personal story?
Well, I had a lot of material. I had all of his letters. When we met, he was living in Massachusetts in Marlborough, and I was living in New York, so we had a series of letters that went back and forth there. He'd come to New York, spend time with me, and then he'd go home and he'd write more letters. And then he wrote some pieces for the 173rd Airborne Yearbook. And he wrote 3 pieces. They were published by Turner. And so I had these essays, and then boom, he went back into the Army. He re-enlisted. So now I had 3 years more of letters. And while I was, having another life, getting married and having a child, I had this log of things. And whenever I read them, I was really quite overcome again that his letters were so poignant and moving and well written. I think while Mike is not a half of the book, Mike is a half of the book. Mike wrote beautifully, and he did express the points about war, the points about being in battle, the points about what he went through in those letters and to me. And he gave me a bunch of books to read. He told me to read these books, and they were Vietnam books. And I must say, I probably was, a psychopath at that point. I was running a business, but I was so immersed in Vietnam that I knew a lot about Vietnam.
Now, you say he was a great writer, and he wrote and expressed himself so well. Did he express himself in the same way, speaking to you face to face, or were his letters a way to open up and reveal things to you that he wouldn't necessarily have in casual conversation?
I think the point is casual conversation. I don't think face to face Mike ever really expressed, except after a big blowout, he might be coming down and be exhausted and then talking about the war to me. But a lot of what came out was explosive information to me. And it was hard to understand it. It was hard to wrap my arms around it. I was 32 when I met Mike, and I didn't have a wonderful record of boyfriends and relationships. So I was afraid that maybe I had, crawled back down and had that kind of a relationship before that I didn't want. I had a business, I was very successful, and when Michael's stories were so enamoring, that I had to help him, I had to be there for him. And then he did things like, after he wrote 3 pieces for the yearbook, he re-enlisted. And he didn't tell me about it. So
well, let's talk about that then, too. He re-enlisted, and suddenly you are an Army wife.
I'm mad. No, I'm not married yet.
Oh, you're not married?
No.
So you're just mad?
I'm mad. I'm definitely mad.
What called him back? What?
I think that when we went to visit the 173rd at their reunion, we saw this whole room, of this large room, this reception room full of really intelligent, wonderful men who were insightful and articulate and moving. And
inspirational.
And subtle, inspirational, definitely. And some of them were still in, you know, it was a reunion. Some of them were older. And Michael was floating. It was a floating time for him. He was living with his mother. He didn't like New York necessarily, except to visit.
That's where you were, in New York at the time.
Yeah. And I think he wrote a fabulous piece that's in the back, in the appendix section of this. And it's the Fight for Hill 187. In Vietnam, you fought for a hill. But the 173rd were the people who went into this hill, didn't know it was highly tunneled. And I think there were 3 Medal of Honor winners from that battle. I think it took place for a number of days. And nearly all of the forces for the 173rd, for the Americans, were killed. There were very few survivors, and that fortified Mike. That definitely inspired Mike. When he brought the manuscript to mail it, that same day he went to the recruiting office here in Marlborough.
Wow.
Yeah. And he wasn't going to tell me until he saw me again, but he called me right away.
Now, I believe in the book you had plans early on, before you even met Mike, that you wanted to write a piece about the Vietnam War. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Did you ever end up writing that piece, or is this the...
I think that this is it.
This is it?
Some of the interviews that I did are reiterated here. But I had only found those people, those guys who, at that time, who hadn't served, who somehow escaped, who used every means that there was. And there were lots of means. You could become a school teacher in an impoverished area. You could go into the medicine profession. You could become a overeducated. I had a boyfriend with 2 master's degrees, you know, and that all was to avoid the war.
Wow.
So you're young, you don't remember that, but to me, guys were so different from girls at that time. 1968, 69 was my years of getting out of high school, 68, Mike 69. And guys were faced very early on with a very serious, you know, consideration. What were they going to do? How were they going to, for many people, avoid the war? Were they going to enlist? My brother went into the Air Force. He was 3 years older than me. But women didn't think that way. Girls didn't think that way. And we didn't even think to think it. Until a long look back, when I was saying, the war changed our lives. The war made me go off and take care of myself. You know, that was absolutely a definite.
So, of course, we're on WMCT-TV. We're here in Marlborough. How is this a Marlborough story?
Oh, this is a Marlborough story. We met in theater. We met in YTW. We were a youth theater workshop. We did theater together.
Wildcat?
I was the star of Wildcat.
Hey, Look Me Over? You're going to sing these 6...
Look me over, lend me an ear.
Love it.
I have no voice left. Anyway, I have no voice left, but I also have a cold, so you're not going to get any more.
All is forgiven.
But in Wildcat, Mike was the second lead, the second male lead. He played a little Spanish guy who falls in love with my sister. So he was kind of my punching bag. But yeah, you know, we were in theater. Theater led me to Boston Conservatory of Music. That's where I went for a year. I heard that.
Oh.
Yeah.
Musical theater, or what did he? No way.
Yeah. Sure. I did summer stock in Weston, Vermont. And that's what happened to me. I went off. And Mike now is graduating. It's Marlborough. He early enlisted. He early upped.
So I know you reconnect years later, but were you close in your youth?
In theater?
In theater and anything, in school? And
You know, we weren't. He was a year behind me, so you know, you look down on those kids.
yes.
But what happened, why the title is 3003 Days, it's from the day I meet him. I meet him at the wall dedication.
You re-meet him.
I re-meet him.
Yes.
And it's really compelling. I mean, you know, I meet this guy from my hometown.
In a sea of
150,000 other people.
the chances, it's kismet.
Absolutely.
But was it kismet?
Absolutely.
Looking back, is there meaning to this when you look at your relationship and him being such a significant part of your life and in and out? Is it profound in any way? Did it change who you are for the better or worse?
Oh my gosh, totally. But for Mike, I mean, I was at a reading last night that I did, and my sister-in-law, a creamer, was there, and she said, Martha gave us 10 more years of Michael. Michael was on his way to Washington on a bus provided by the Marlborough whoever department, Veterans Affairs, and he was going to kill himself. He had decided that was the last thing he was going to do. He was going to honor the guys on the wall who he knew, and when he came back, he was going to kill himself, and he met me. First, he met the herd, the 173rd. And because you wear insignia, if you're a vet, often, you know, that's how I recognized him, but that's how someone else recognized him. And he had a combat medic's badge on, and his friend, who became his friend, Frank Baker, hooked up with him, caught him. My life totally took another move. And I had started to read books on my own, but now I had his input, and that's what I was looking for. That's why I went and thought I wasn't going to get. I just thought it was too private and personal, and guys were meeting up with guys who they hadn't seen and didn't know were still alive, and I got all teary and choked up, and I couldn't interrupt that. But where Mike was in a concession line stand, looking at his watch, and me looking at his watch and then looking at his name.
You put that together and said.
I said, "Oh my gosh, I know that guy. I know him from somewhere."
Wow. And Martha, I believe you have an excerpt. Do you want to give me a little lead-in? What are you about to tell me about?
This was Mike. We're apart now, and he's in the Army. He's got a lot of time. He had to go back through basic training.
All over again.
All over again. He was a Spec 5 when he left the Army from Vietnam, and I'd like to talk about that at some point, about the process of going and coming in and out of Vietnam. But he's in the Army, and he's the acting platoon sergeant because he knows what's going on. He knows the routine. But he's got a lot of time to write. I did not go to live with him in Fort Campbell, Kentucky. I had a business, so he was writing letters to me to things that came up for him.
And this is one of those letters?
This is one of those letters. It's a good letter. My dearest Martha Mary, 23rd January, 84. There are two incidents in my personal history where my life was saved by the merest chance, where I would have died had it not been for the incidental moves made minutes or seconds before. Sometimes I wake up at night, nervous and sweaty, overwhelmed at what a thin thread there was between survival and oblivion at those moments, and terrified that it all came so close to going the other way. The first was in the Suica Valley on the Tuesday morning before Thanksgiving, 1970. My team was set up in an L-shaped ambush on a trail junction. We opened fire on a column of NVA, and I let off my first 20-round magazine until it went dry. I was partially covered by a 6-inch diameter tree to my front and was semi-leaning against another of the same size to my rear, sitting to get a better view of the kill zone through the foliage. I ducked my head down in a matter of maybe 8 inches as I did my rapid reload, and a split second later, even as my head was still moving, a stream of green AK-47 tracers came from my front and shattered the rearmost tree, literally blew it in half at precisely the point where my head had been. Years later, I was in Washington, D.C. on 13 November, 1982. I needed a drink because my throat was hoarse. I also needed to go to the bathroom. I decided to ignore that latter urge because the lines were too long. I stood in a concession stand line for several minutes and then spotted what seemed to be a shorter line at another concession. I moved to it. There I met the woman who made my life over. And it frightens me how close we came to not finding each other that day. What would have become of me without you? Words I can never say. I love you, Mike C.
It's beautiful. It's also very dramatic. Did he have a flair for the dramatic?
We both did.
You both did. It's reminiscent of flowery Shakespeare. You know, it paints beautiful pictures, and he's in the midst of the action, but the way he paints the drama of being in war is the same drama that he brings to meeting you. It's heightened, it's elevated.
He wanted to be a writer.
Yeah.
I think he did not trust his own instincts, I think he lost it along the way. I think the war and the incidents of the war, and later he went to Zaire, and he was run out of Zaire too, having to fight off Angolan rebels who were storming their work site. He lost a place he could write. He didn't have a place he could write until he came out of the Army, and we had a house in Connecticut, and he set up a desk and he set up a room, and I think Mike got lost too. I think he got lost. I mean, I lost him. To see a vet, any vet, change from recognizing things within him, comme ça, to veering off a path where he's not in control of his own being. He's not in control of things he says that are hurtful, things he says that are deliberate, things he says to cover his own insecurities, and things he says because he's got PTSD, and he was terribly affected by Agent Orange. So that in combination...
Many things, he's a changed man.
A changed man.
And at the time, PTSD, is that even a term that is known?
And not bandied about, boy. It got to be, in his lifetime, a time, you know, in the 3,003 days, he does file for disability. He files for disability, and he's 70% disabled. So he has an income that isn't a whole lot, but it's an income that...
Are these physical disabilities, or is it all mental?
It's largely mental.
Largely mental.
But at the same time, he had physical movement.
Mobility
issues, yeah. PTSD and Agent Orange affected the larger bones, and he had osteoarthritis really bad from jumping out of helicopters with a very heavy pack on. So he had a pack, and then he had the medic's pack in addition, and he had his gun. And so he was a little guy. He was, 5'4". He probably weighed 130 maybe. Yeah.
This story transcends because it's still a very relevant story now, and I know you wanted to speak on that and maybe the process of going in and out of Vietnam as well.
Let it just be said that Mike went in alone and he came out alone. That back then, that was the process. That's what they did. They needed guys in Vietnam. They needed medics. He was a medic. He was a trained medic, Fort Sam Houston. But it was something that the Army did, and that they have corrected now. They don't send individuals into combat. They were the new guy. They were the cherry. How do you know that this guy's going to be good in battle? So Mike was first in a medical unit, a MASH unit, and then he got Soldier of the Month while he was in that medical unit. And the 173rd said, what do you want to do? We'll give you the opportunity to do whatever you want to do. And he said, I want to be a ranger. So he became part of a 6-man team that went into the woods, went into the forest, the jungles, to do reconnaissance. He was a LARP, and he was so proud of that. But I think that he had the heightened experience of being with this core bunch of guys that he could trust no end, And when he came out, he didn't have that. He had friends, yes, but they didn't really serve in combat. And
they didn't understand then.
No,
they didn't get it.
In the book, I say that Mike says, you'll never understand. No matter how many times I tell you, you'll never understand.
This is such a courageous story to share publicly. How does it feel now that it's public and published and out in the open? And what do you hope people will take away from it?
Well, Ryan, I have to say that was my first emotion. I said to my husband, Dennis, I put it out there. It was between its publication, the printing part, and the publication. I self-published. And I said, everybody's going to know everything about me. And so many people, even last night, but prior when I was at the Marlborough Historical Society, said, that's about me. Thank you. I needed that. That was brave of you. I got brave a lot. And I guess you don't expect that kind of response from writing a book. I didn't anyway. Yes, it was brave, but I wanted to publish the truth about the Vietnam generation, what we endured, and that it's still alive. That part of that, whether it's your father or your grandfather or your kid who just came back from Iraq and can't talk about the war, that war lingers on. It's familial, and until we face the realities of deprogramming these kids from this awful stuff they endured. Awful. Then we're going to have suicides, we're going to have mental health issues, we're going to have flare-ups, we're going to have divorces, we're going to have, you know, it's continual.
Let's talk about your support group, because you're joined in the studio today. You have some family members here.
I do.
And I'm wondering, how did reliving these memories change your perspective on life and love today?
I have the greatest love. My husband has been so supportive. It took 8 years to write the book, probably about 1.5 years to figure out all of the publishing nuances. I got a endorsement from Ken Burns, and that delayed the book by 4 months, you know. So all this time, you wonder if you're doing the right thing. And for me, I had my husband. My Voutas Donegan was remarkable, and people say that how you know, here's this book about Mike and me. This is the love story. How did you endure it? And how did you endure it, honey? But he did. He knew that I was kind of destined to write. At one point, he said, "I hate your job. I'll support you." We were, you know, in New York City. We were doing well. "I'll support you. Write for 1 year." Right. He knew I wanted to.
How do you think Mike would feel knowing you shared your story and his story in this book?
I think that Mike would be really happy that his words were out there, that his viewpoint was out there, that he was able to express himself posthumously. The next book I'm going to do is his letters from Zaire, which aren't about me at all, because I think he needs to be out there. I think he has a voice for the ages. I think he was a gallant and heroic man.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks, Ryan, for
Where
having
can people find this book? I know it's self-published. Where's the best place that you would recommend someone pick it up?
Well, it is in Worcester, Massachusetts. It's at the Tide Pool bookshop. She has some left. You can order it from Barnes & Noble online, and they'll ship it in a couple days. I like Barnes & Noble over Amazon just because it's a brick and mortar. You can order it from Amazon also. There's also an ebook from both of those sources. The ebook is very inexpensive. I kept the book as inexpensive as I could so that more people would read it. I want everyone who has any interest in understanding Vietnam to pick it up. So.
Well, thank you for joining me to talk about your book, 3003 Days of Mike and Me. This beautiful story explores the tragedies of war, its psychological toll on veterans, and the rippling impacts on families and relationships. And with its ties right here to Marlborough, it's sure to be of interest to all of you viewers. This brings us to the end of this Marlborough Minute. I'm Ryan Malyar, and thanks for watching.